When a storm seals every road, what opens a house wider charity or grief that refuses to die? The chapel bell had rung 6 times when Thomas Kellerman set his coffee cup aside and walked to the barn. Morning frost silvered the split rails of his fence, and his breath clouded white in the thin Colorado air. 37 head of cattle dotted the meadow beyond, their hides steaming in the early light. He'd been counting fence staples like coins again, a habit that had grown stronger since Martha's death 3 months past. Each staple cost 2 cents at Brennan's store. The south pasture fence needed 47 new ones, nearly $1 he didn't have. Inside the barn, tucked beneath a horse blanket behind the feed bins, sat the cradle he'd been avoiding since August. Martha had asked him to repair the split headboard before the baby came, but the fever took her first, and the child with her. Now the broken cradle sat like an accusation. Its headboard hanging by a single wooden peg. Thomas lifted it into the light. The crack ran straight through the carved rose Martha's father had etched there 20 years ago. He traced the split with his thumb, feeling the roughness where the wood had failed. "Should burn it," he said to the empty barn, but his hands were already reaching for his plane. The work went slowly. The headboard had split clean, but the wood around the carved rose was delicate. One wrong stroke and Martha's father's work would be ruined forever. Thomas worked with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be, shaving thin curls of pine until the edges aligned true. By noon, he'd fitted a dowel joint and carved a small reinforcement that followed the line of the original rose. The crack was still visible, a thin seam running through the bloom, but the headboard would hold. He set the cradle on his kitchen table and stepped back. It looked smaller than he remembered, and strangely perfect in the afternoon light that slanted through Martha's clean windows. The repair had left the rose with a new line through its center, as if lightning had touched it without destroying it. The chapel bell rang twice for the hour. Thomas wrapped the cradle in a clean sheet and carried it to his wagon. Brennan's General Store occupied the corner where Main Street met the Denver Road, its false front painted white and blue like a flag. Thomas tied his horse to the rail and carried the wrapped cradle inside, where the smell of coffee beans and leather filled the warm air. Tom. Patrick Brennan looked up from his ledger, wire spectacles perched on his nose. "Got something there?" "Cradle needs a home." Thomas set the bundle on the counter between the penny candy and the roll of telegraph wire. Figured maybe somebody. "Let's see it." Thomas pulled away the sheet. The cradle's maple wood gleamed with the oil he'd rubbed into it that morning. The repaired headboard showed its seam, but the carved rose caught the light like it had been blessed. Brennan ran his hand along the rails. "Fine work." "Martha's father made this?" 20 years passed. "I fixed the headboard this morning. The Kowalski woman's expecting. Baby due before Christmas." Brennan touched the rose gently. "But Tom, she's got no money for something this fine." "Didn't ask for money." The store's front door opened with a brass bell's chime. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison entered, her black dress rustling, a basket of eggs balanced on her hip. She was the town's midwife, a small woman with steady hands and a voice that could calm a spooked horse. "Morning, Patrick." "Thomas." She set her eggs on the counter and noticed the cradle. "Oh my, that's beautiful work." "Tom's looking to place it with a family that needs it," Brennan said. Adelaide lifted the cradle slightly, testing its weight and balance. Her experienced hands found the repair in the headboard, tracing the seam through the carved rose. "The wood held true," she said quietly. "Sometimes the mended places are the strongest." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening after a long winter. "The Kowalski baby's not due till December," Adelaide continued, But Mary Kowalski's been sewing baby clothes from flour sacks. This cradle would mean the world to her. Then it's hers, Thomas said. Adelaide looked at him carefully. Tom, there's something else. The Hendersons lost their roof in last week's wind. Jim Henderson's been sleeping in their barn with the 3 children, while Sarah stays with her sister in town. If this weather turns, and it will, those children will need more than a barn for shelter. Thomas knew Jim Henderson by sight, a homesteader who'd claimed 160 acres east of town 2 years back. Good man, but green as spring grass when it came to high country winters. What's that got to do with the cradle? Thomas asked. Nothing, Adelaide said. But you asked if somebody needed something. The Hendersons need help, and you've got an empty barn. The store's brass bell chimed again as another customer entered. Thomas recognized the man, Frank Walsh, who owned the sawmill down by the creek. Walsh nodded to them and moved toward the hardware shelves. Think on it, Adelaide said to Thomas. Sometimes mending one thing shows us how to mend another. Thomas rewrapped the cradle in its sheet. Outside, the wind was picking up, driving thin clouds across the peaks to the west. Weather coming, sure enough. By Thursday, the Henderson children were sleeping in Thomas's barn loft. Jim Henderson had arrived Tuesday evening with a wagon containing everything his family owned. 3 children under 8 years old, a pregnant wife, 2 milk cows, a crate of chickens, and a folded paper that turned out to be their homestead deed. Thomas had read the deed by lamplight, while Sarah Henderson put the children to bed in the hayloft. The document was properly filed and notarized, but it described land that would kill them all if they tried to winter there without a proper house. This section's got no windbreak, Thomas told Jim, pointing to the surveyor's marks on the deed. Come January, the wind'll blow straight down from the divide with nothing to stop it. Jim's face had gone pale. The land agent said it was good ground. Ground's fine for crops, but you need shelter first, and lumber costs more than you've got. Thomas folded the deed carefully. Your family can stay in the barn till spring. We'll build you a proper place when the weather breaks. Now, 3 days later, Thomas was wondering if he'd made a mistake. The children were well behaved, but his quiet house had become something else entirely. Sarah Henderson cooked breakfast for 7 people instead of 1. Her youngest, a girl of 4 named Lucy, had taken to following Thomas around the property, asking endless questions about cattle and chickens and why the mountains had snow on top. The cradle sat in the kitchen where Sarah could see it while she worked. She'd asked about it once, whose it was, why he had it, and Thomas had told her simply that it was meant for the Kowalski baby when the time came. It's beautiful, she'd said, running her hand along the repaired headboard. You can hardly see where it was mended. Friday morning brought the first real cold snap. The chapel bell rang 6 times through air, so clear it hurt to breathe. Thomas found ice in the water troughs and knew they had maybe a week before the serious weather hit. He was forking hay to the cattle when young Lucy Henderson appeared at his elbow, her breath clouding white in the morning air. Mr. Kellerman, why do you live all by yourself? Thomas stopped his work. The child wore a coat that had belonged to one of her brothers, the sleeves rolled up to free her hands. Sometimes that's just how things are, he said. Mama says your wife went to heaven. That's right. Lucy considered this. Is that why you fixed the baby bed? Thomas felt that same door opening in his chest, wider this time. Maybe so. The wind picked up, rattling the barn's siding. To the west, dark clouds were building against the peaks like a wall. Storm coming, Thomas said, more to himself than to the child. Daddy says we'll go back to our house when it's finished. Your daddy's right. But Thomas knew Jim Henderson's house was still just a foundation and a pile of lumber that wouldn't last the winter. The homestead deed in his pocket felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. That evening, Adelaide Morrison arrived with her medical bag and news from town. Mary Kowalski's labour started this morning, she announced, hanging her coat by the kitchen door. Baby should be here by midnight. Sarah Henderson looked up from the stew she was stirring. In this weather, babies come when they come, storm or no storm. Adelaide glanced at the cradle. Tom, if you're still willing to part with that, tonight would be the night. Thomas nodded. Outside, the wind was building to a howl, and the first snow had started to fall in thick, wet flakes that clung to the windows. I'll take it over soon as the weather breaks, he said. Might not break for days, Adelaide warned. This one's got the feel of a 3-day blow. She was right. By morning, 2 feet of snow had buried the fences, and the wind was driving the flakes horizontal across the pasture. The Hendersons' wagon was completely buried, just a hump of white in the yard. Inside the warm kitchen, with 7 people crowded around his table for breakfast, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha died. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. A sense that the house was doing what houses were meant to do. After breakfast, he found Jim Henderson staring out at the storm. There's no going back to the homestead now, Jim said quietly. Not till spring. Thomas handed him a cup of coffee. Spring's not so far off. My deed says I have to have a house built and be living on the land by January 1st, or I lose the claim. This was news to Thomas. He thought about the folded paper upstairs in his bedroom and about the wall of snow outside that would take weeks to clear. Let me see that deed again, he said. The storm blew for 4 days. When it finally cleared, the world had changed. Snow lay 6 feet deep in the drifts, and the road to town was impassable. But the sun came out fierce and bright, turning the whole valley into a field of diamonds. Thomas and Jim Henderson spent the morning digging paths to the barn and the chicken coop. The cattle had survived by bunching together in the lee of the hayshed, but 2 chickens had frozen despite Sarah's best efforts to keep them warm. By afternoon, they'd cleared enough snow to hitch the draft horses to the heavy sled Thomas used for hauling hay. Adelaide Morrison had been right about one thing: the cradle couldn't wait any longer for delivery. The Kowalski baby was born during the storm. Adelaide had told them when she'd finally made it through the snow that morning. Healthy boy, but Mary's been asking about the cradle. Seems word got around that Tom Kellerman was giving away the finest baby bed in the county. Thomas loaded the cradle onto the sled, securing it with rope against the jolting ride ahead. The snow was so deep that the sled runners barely cleared the surface, and the horses laboured with each step. Halfway to town, they met another sled coming the other way. Thomas recognized the driver. It was Patrick Brennan from the general store, bundling against the cold with a scarf wrapped around his face. "Tom!" Brennan called out, pulling his horses to a stop. "Been looking for you. Got news about the Henderson claim." Jim Henderson straightened up on the sled seat. "What kind of news?" Brennan pulled a folded document from his coat. "Telegram came from the Territorial Land Office yesterday, just before the storm hit. There's been a delay in the homestead requirements. New settlers get till March 1st to establish residence, account of the early winter." Thomas felt the weight of the folded deed in his own pocket. He'd been carrying it for days, studying the surveyor's marks, thinking about what it would mean for the Henderson family. "That's good news," Thomas said carefully. "More than good," Brennan replied. "Gives you time to build proper, Jim. No rushing through construction in winter weather." But Thomas was thinking about something else. The Henderson homestead was 160 acres of good bottom land, but it was 7 miles from town and completely exposed to the north wind. Even with proper construction, it would be a hard place to make a living. His own ranch was 240 acres of deeded land, with timber, water rights and buildings that could house 2 families comfortably. And he was one man, living alone in a house meant for children. "Jim," Thomas said suddenly, "what would you say to a different kind of arrangement?" Both men looked at him. "My place is bigger than I need. Good water, sheltered ground, close enough to town for the children's schooling. What if we worked it together? Partnership, with papers drawn up legal." Jim Henderson's face went through several expressions: surprise, hope, caution. "Tom, I appreciate the offer, but I can't pay you what land like yours is worth." "Didn't ask for money." Thomas pulled the Henderson deed from his pocket. "You've got 160 acres of grassland. I've got buildings and water rights. Seems like we each have something the other needs." The wind had died to nothing, and the only sound was the horses breathing and the creak of leather harness. "You do that?" Jim asked. "Been thinking about it since the storm started. House is too quiet for one man, and I'm getting too old to work all this land alone." Brennan was grinning. "I can draw up a partnership agreement that protects both families. Done it before for other folks." Thomas looked at the cradle on his sled, wrapped in its clean sheet. "First things first, we've got a delivery to make." The Kowalski house sat at the end of a lane that had been tramped down by neighbors bringing food and congratulations. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air, and lamplight glowed yellow in the windows. Thomas carried the cradle to the front door, where Mary Kowalski met them with her new son in her arms. She was a small woman with tired eyes and a smile that lit up her whole face when she saw what Thomas had brought. "Oh my," she said softly. "It's more beautiful than I imagined." Thomas set the cradle down in her front room, where the fire had warmed the air to a drowsy heat. The baby was wrapped in a quilt that looked like it had been pieced together from scraps of many different fabrics, a bit of blue here, some yellow there, all bound together with careful stitches. "The headboard's been repaired," Thomas said, running his finger along the seam through the carved rows. "But it's solid." Mary Kowalski placed her son in the cradle and stepped back. The baby settled immediately, as if he recognized the place that had been made for him. "It's perfect," she said. "How can I ever thank you?" Thomas thought about that question. 3 months ago, he would have said no thanks were needed. But now, standing in this warm house with this young family, he understood that gratitude was something that flowed both ways. "Just seeing it used is thanks enough," he said. Spring came early that year. By the first week of March, the snow had melted enough for construction work, and Thomas found himself supervising the building of a second house on his property, a smaller place for the Henderson family, close enough to the main house for shared meals and common work, but far enough away for privacy. The partnership papers had been signed and filed at the county seat. Jim Henderson's grassland claim was sold to a cattle company from Denver, and the money went toward lumber and materials. The Henderson children were enrolled in the school in town, and Sarah Henderson had taken over much of the cooking and household work that Martha used to do. Thomas still lived alone in the main house, but it was no longer a quiet place. Children's voices carried across the yard most days, and the kitchen table was set for 7 more often than for 1. On a warm afternoon in late April, Adelaide Morrison stopped by with news that Mary Kowalski's baby was thriving, and that she'd had 3 more requests for Thomas to repair broken cradles. "Seems you've started something," Adelaide said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into a chair by the kitchen window. Thomas considered this. The cradle he'd repaired sat in the Kowalski house now, where it belonged. But the act of repairing it had led to something else. A kind of mending he hadn't expected. Maybe that's how it works, he said. Fix one thing, and it shows you how to fix another. Adelaide nodded. Sometimes the mended places are the strongest. Outside, Jim Henderson was teaching his oldest boy how to repair fence, and Sarah Henderson was hanging laundry on the line between the two houses. The chapel bell rang 3 times for the hour, its sound carrying clear and sweet across the valley. Thomas thought about the folded partnership papers upstairs in his bedroom, and about the cradle with its seam running through the carved rows like lightning that had touched without destroying. Some repairs were meant to show, he'd learned. They told the story of what had been broken and what had been made whole again. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the open window. And Thomas smiled. He'd been counting fence staples like coins for so long that he'd forgotten how to count the things that mattered more. If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.